Okay, folks, welcome to our last lecture for HI121. It's a bit of a short one. I'm giving you a little historiographical problem to end on. And we're lingering still in the Mediterranean world, mostly because it's a way of bringing things back around full circle to how we're used to looking at the ancient world. And coming back to the question of where the ancient world ends is a useful one because so often from a Eurocentric viewpoint, that ending has been defined as, the end of the 5th century or 476 CE, the fall of the Roman Empire. We've already pointed out that some scholars have moved away from this by looking at the dust veil and the plague as breakpoints. But as we discussed in that last lecture, that's not the best way to approach the problem either. Quite simply, there are no clear breakpoints, not even in the Mediterranean world. Ancient versus not ancient is kind of arbitrary no matter where you put it. Medieval is problematic if you're using it anywhere outside of Europe. But really, civilization does not suddenly change into something completely unrecognizable. In fact, there is always more continuity than discontinuity. One of the scholars who recognizes that most clearly is Peter Brown, sometimes called the father of late antiquity. So I'm going to talk about his famous book, which launches a whole revolution in how we divided the uh, ancient world from the medieval world as historians. So he comes up with the idea of late antiquity, and honestly, he's borrowing it from German scholars, so it's not original to him. He brings it into English, basically. And he defined it as the period between 200 and 700 CE, and calls it a period of extremes. And this is part of the problem with it. On one hand, there are ancient ruins everywhere you look, both literal and metaphorical. On the other hand, there's so much that was new kingdoms, new peoples, new cultures. Brown points out how difficult it is to know what it was like to live in that world, especially when so many of our sources are either highly conservative or highly radical in reaction. He sees late antiquity as an almost impossibly complex period, not simply on the political level, but also on the social, even emotional levels. So his initial focus in the world of late antiquity was on the Mediterranean and the Near East, but he does branch out as he continues to write about the period. His focus is also primarily cultural and religious, and that's the key thing to remember when discussing any iteration of late antiquity. Now, that doesn't mean he failed to take into account politics and economics. He certainly does. I mean, for instance, when he's looking at this period in this very first book, he sees one of the primary problems facing late antique society as how you maintain a style of life and culture that was originally based on a culture of coastal city states. These cities, which had maybe 10% of the population, essentially lived off the other 90%. Cities could not supply enough food to feed themselves, so the network of roads was a way of funneling supplies from the periphery to the center. Now, he also recognizes that the empire did impose itself very harshly on the 90% sometimes. I've always thought this was one of the big strengths of his ideas, that he has no illusions about how unpleasant it must have been at times to live under late imperial rule. But again, he is Irish, so that could be why. He sees some very sharp cultural differences within the empire itself, between the aristocrats, who all spoke a similar language and practiced a similar way of life, and the rest of the citizenry, which in the late antique period also included the so called barbarians. Looking at 200 CE, he sees conformity as the key. If you conform to the Roman way of life, you were accepted. If you deviated, so for instance, if you were Jewish or Christian or had opted out, if you had transgressed certain boundaries. But he also sees the adoption of Greek culture reshaping Roman society. He calls it a shifting gravity to the east, towards the Greek cities of Asia Minor. So this is why in his initial work he's not really worried about the decline and fall, because that's something he sees as only affecting the political structure of the Western provinces. He sees the East as a cultural powerhouse. It's almost untouched. And even the West still remains a sub-Roman civilization, he argues, for centuries. So he sees the 4th century in particular as a time of revival, but also of great social stress. And it is primarily characterized by a widening gulf between the rich and the poor. There's less differentiation in urban life. Small towns become less important, whereas the great cities maintain this lavish lifestyle. The great landowners in the provinces concentrate more and more wealth into their own hands, and aristocracies become much more local in nature. Now, he sees the eastern half of the empire as a more complex society, or rather, a society where more people participated in the empire successfully than they did in the west. Now, the next major, forgot my animations on this one. The next major element of Brown's thought is that after 400, the history of the late antique world is basically what to do about the barbarians. And he points out that East and West found different routes to adjust. So his take on the failure of the Western government is interesting. He thinks that they basically thought it was too costly, too involved to try and Romanize them, and that they basically separate themselves from the fate of the Roman army in order to save the senatorial aristocracy and the church. So he goes on to point out they can actually do without the army. They use the barbarians to fight for them, and sometimes it works out quite well. Now, since they didn't care to Romanize the barbarians, with the exception of the Franks under Clovis, the formation of new barbarian states was inevitable. And so the local Roman aristocracy had to refocus their energies on building up local power bases. This could include seeking power through the church. So this is why we see so many aristocratic bishops whose families were closely tied to the see of their respective cities. We also see other paths to power, where Roman aristocrats would serve as courtiers to barbarian kings. The best example of this is Cassiodorus, whom we mentioned in the last lecture, and Theodoric the Great. Now, in Italy, the transition to a post-Roman, but very Romanesque kingdom was so complete that Justinian's reconquest was actually seen as a disaster by the Italian senators. Now, what we think was going on is that possibly the wealth and sophistication of the Western Empire might have been overstated to begin with. I mean, we see monuments and we think they were richer than they were. Brown is quoted as saying the command economy is deceptive. And he came up with this great idea of a low-pressure state when he's talking about the West. He says, they focused on regional interests. They had a functioning, if somewhat sluggish economy. Was this a bad thing? Did they need long-distance trade? Did they need luxury goods from the East? Is complex better than simple? This is the thing that always grabs me about Brown. He takes a turn towards the philosophical, just often enough to make you question the underlying assumptions of your thinking. I mean, what was good about the Western Empire? Why was it a loss? Why was it a fall? Why wasn't it just considered to be a change? Now, there's another term he uses, cultural empire. This is a direct rejection of traditional thinking. It focuses instead on the exchange of symbolic goods or ideas. So he's more or less rejecting the concept of regression. In the early Middle Ages, he says it's a value judgment. He will waggle his finger at you for that. Instead, he prefers to talk about downsizing. So yeah, he admits urban life did diminish. But cultural empires reoriented themselves, so they started focusing on other structures. So in the West, rural monasteries. Now, you might wonder why I'm bringing Brown up right now, because, let me see, how can I explain this? He is a perfect example, really, of how somebody can completely reevaluate the underlying assumptions of an entire historical subdiscipline. People thought they knew what ended the Western Empire for such a long time. And Brown, he comes in, he doesn't want to play that game. He just says, no, don't care what ended it. I care why it changed. And there are other scholars who followed him who said, we shouldn't even be talking about why it fell. We should be talking about why it survived so long. This moving away from the traditional narrative and seeing it with completely different eyes, that is a rare, rare gift, really. I mean, Brown himself has completely changed the very vocabulary that historians use when they can discuss the period. You don't hear about the decline and fall so often. You hear about the transformation of the Roman world. And isn't that better? Shouldn't we be taking morality out of it? That was Gibbon's problem. He saw the fall as a sort of moral failing on the part of the empire. Now, there has been pushback, definitely, against Brown, but they can't really criticize Brown. They could, especially Brown, when he went on and started writing more about the West, because that's when his ideas got really interesting. But they can criticize the people who followed him and sort of oversimplified his ideas. I mean, Brown is hard to fight because he's kind of like the tide. He's washed away a lot of the ground beneath the traditionalists' feet just by thinking clearly, and there's no going back. I mean, the people who take Brown and kind of go over the top with his ideas, they can be criticized, but it's very hard to effectively criticize Peter Brown. Very few people have managed to do it. I mean, you will get historians that argue resolutely, yes, hey, the barbarian invasions were still invasions, still traumatic. But even they have to stop and admit that, okay, the relationship between Rome and these new peoples was more complex than that. After all, are you being invaded if you invite people to settle on your land and help defend you? Even if you're not happy about how it goes, even if the relationship turns sour, that's not an invasion. That is you not managing your relationship with your neighbors particularly well. Now, sometimes historians make the argument that there was a decline and fall simply because there was a less vibrant material culture in the West. Not as many types of goods available, smaller churches, fewer public buildings. I mean, but Brown would come back and say, nah, it's not a decline, it's a localization of economic activity. Now, a lot of this argument comes back to how this period has actually been received by different audiences. I mean, to circle back around to a lot of what we've been doing with our tutorial readings, Italian scholars, for instance, are much less likely to diminish the importance of the fall of the Western Empire because they grew up surrounded by Roman ruins. American historians, on the other hand, might be like, Rome, okay, whatever. They're a little bit easier on that subject because they're not socially conditioned since birth to see the ruins of empire surrounding them. I mean, our ideas about the so-called barbarians have changed entirely over the last 70 years simply because of what the Nazis believed about them and because the historical profession has tried so hard to distance themselves from that. I mean, a lot of what we grew up thinking is simple historical truth is actually just in the eye of the beholder, and it breaks down pretty quickly when you exert a little pressure on those underlying assumptions. I mean, the discussion of when the ancient world ends in Europe and Western Asia will never be the same after Brown. And he is a good example of breaking down paradigms and widening horizons. And I mean, I'm ending with him because in a way, that's what this course has been about all along, underneath all of it. I mean, yeah, we've been doing case studies, but why have we been doing case studies? So that you can see history is exploding out of the restrictions of the traditional narrative. The ancient world is not all about Greece and Rome. Even the parts that are about Greece and Rome, it's not really what you thought they were. There's so much more to it. History is gloriously messy. And on that note, guys, it has been a pleasure. And I will look forward to one last Zoom session with you next week. And thank you very much for listening to me this whole term and my somewhat goofy lecture recordings. Hope you have enjoyed.